This is the Founder's Catalyst. Hello there, as I finish my drink, and welcome back to the most recent installment of the Founder's Catalyst. Lee Povey, how are you, sir?
I'm disappointed, Steve.
Oh gosh, why is that?
Yeah, I'm disappointed that you haven't said anything about my new background.
Well, I apologize. Technically, I have a new background as well, because I can't go upstairs right now as I recover from my hip. So you didn't say it either, but
because you'd already told me, and I went, "Oh, yes,
I know, it's true. Lee, tell us about your new background.
I'm excited, Steve, that I now have some things here in my new bookshelf that represent me, my life, some of my favorite books, some pictures of me and my athletes, my dog Raya up there, my wife and me, Sarah, my go-karting helmets here, and then a couple of my sporting achievements over here, and then this nice wooden slats to kind of tie it all together.
I love it. It is very just easy on the eyes. I will say that. And it's
just
good.
the bloke in front of it that ruins it.
I mean, your words. But what I'm really excited about on this episode is that, as we are all too familiar with in our world as coaches, this is the time of the year. This episode's coming out right as we round the corner of Q2 and we head into Q3, and we start looking at those lofty goals, commitments, expectations, strategies, etc. that we had that looked really, really good. We typed them up, we put them on some really nice paper, we blasted them on walls and things like that in our places of work. And we were so sure at the beginning of the year that this is the direction we were going. And there may be some people right now that are looking at that same list of goals and strategies and expectations and visions for the year and may have a cause for concern, may be questioning whether or not they got it right, or that something has gone wrong, or whatever it might be. And here we are as two high-performing executive leadership coaches, and we want to be a voice for you right now as to how you can first deal with that energy effectively, and then secondly, how you can shift from a potential perspective of scarcity into a place of prosperity. And we want to do that in about 30 minutes, which is a tall order, I think, but I think we're both capable, mate. So when you think about how clients of yours over the years have, and even athletes for that matter, have dealt with being in a position where they're like, okay, I know what I set out for, I know what I'm aiming for, and right now I'm sensing that I'm not on track, I'm not where I need to be. Where do you go as a coach typically at that point?
You're going to hate me. I'm going to take a step back first.
Yeah, I know.
So I think there's a few things to recognize and point out. So some of the things that I regularly see is we get too hooked into the bigger prize, and what happens is we get busy in our day-to-day lives, right? So we have this overarching goal, whatever it is, turn the business into $1 billion, get acquired within 5 years, become an Olympic champion, whatever that overarching goal is. And then we get really busy in the day-to-day stuff. So especially for leaders, it's answering the emails, it's getting on calls. And what I see we don't do enough is time in our schedule to think. So time in our schedules to think, time in our schedules to innovate, time in our schedules to be creative. And I listened to a podcast with Simon Sinek maybe a year or 2 years ago that really resonated with me. And he encourages people to book time into their calendars that is free time to go and do things like go and wander around a park, or go to a museum, or just somewhere that takes you out of your normal routine and gives yourself some space. Because I think what happens is we get so caught up in our day-to-day lives and getting our task list done that we forget how to reconnect that task list with the bigger picture. Another one that I think was relevant to this was a podcast that Adam Grant did, where they talked about meeting length. And we've all experienced this. Meetings have two lengths, half an hour or an hour. And he said, well, why don't we have 8-minute meetings? Or why don't we send out a video instead of actually having a meeting? Or why don't we send out an email instead of having a meeting? So where I like to go with this is, I think at periodic times, and typically each quarter, we have to stop and reevaluate how we are turning up in the business and how the business is running, as opposed to, are we on target? How are we doing against our goals? Because we have to understand, is the business running in the correct way for us to do that? And is our time being used in the correct way to do that? And something I routinely see amongst the very highest performers that I work with and I observe is an ability to get rid of all of the fluff. And it's the younger founders and leaders that I work with that get caught into, oh, I must answer every email, or I must do this. The amount of them that struggle to take on an assistant, for example. So one of the first things that I say to founders is, do you have an assistant? If it's a no, get one. Because if you're answering emails that is a $20 an hour job and your income is $500 to $1,000 an hour, that is an unbelievable waste of your time, where you should be doing something that only somebody that earns $500 to $1,000 an hour is capable of doing. And I know we're going in a slightly different direction than what you said,
we're not.
But I think it's really relevant.
No. This is what's funny is, I know you prefaced it with, I want to take a step back, but I actually think you're answering the question directly. I think you're actually saying, like, hey, in this position as a coach, the focus, while it is so tempting, and for the record, I completely agree. Same approach for me as well. While it's so tempting to just make it all about the measurables and the goals and what we're tracking, etc., this is actually the time to look at how we're showing up, how we're behaving, how we're operating, whether as an individual, whether as a leadership team, or whether as an entire organization. Understanding that any goals that we create, the only way we actually provide any kind of definition and meaning and relevance to those goals is by assessing how we're producing the goal, how we're producing the result. Again, you and I come from the world of sport. We would start seasons probably sitting down with an athlete, what do you want to achieve this year? And everything that we're talking about is very measurable. It's a time. It's something that they're doing in the weight room, whatever it is. But from that moment on, everything's about the way we work. It's not about the end result in terms of how we show up each and every day. We understand that there's a method to what is required to achieve that result, but so we make it about the method. We make it about the process. And the concern, the anxiety that I see from folks that I coach today comes from the sense of comparing a future state, i.e. the result. And in the moment we actually get into the present and we talk about the operations and the strategy, the angst starts to go away and the sense of control comes back. It's like, oh, this is the thing I actually have control over. As much as I want those results and I'm telling myself I can control those outcomes, the thing I can control more than anything else is how we produce those outcomes. So this is the time, if any, to be looking at, to your point, if we have certain meetings on our calendars that aren't serving these results, or the way in which we're executing the meeting is not serving the result is not the thing to assess. It's the way we're meeting and the way we're using our time.
Yeah. You don't become an Olympic champion or a billionaire business owner by just saying, I want to become an Olympic champion or a billionaire business owner. There's millions of little steps that go into it to get you there. Daily actions, choices. And what tends to happen is we tend to get stuck working in our business rather than on our business. We get stuck in the daily tasks. Those meetings start to pile up. And instead of stopping and going, does this serve me? Does this serve the business? Should somebody else do this? Can we get rid of this? We get stuck in it and we're busy. And I hear this all the time. Oh, I'm too busy, or I've got too much on, or I've got too many meetings. Great. What ones can you get rid of then? And then there's this fear of, well, if I get rid of that, the business isn't going to succeed. We don't do a good job of stopping and really dialing down into what actually matters and what doesn't matter. Yeah. And that, again, that's what I see with the very highest performers. I think they have a gift in letting go of anything that's going to get in the way and doesn't matter, and focusing purely on what's going to change the game for me here, or what is going to make the difference.
Yeah, immediately it makes me think about a term I use so much in my work, which is that of optimal. I use this term all the time with my clients. And when we start out a 12-month body of work, for instance, we talk about, I always frame goals as commitments as opposed to goals, because I like to anchor it in some of the emotional, the behavioral, and the procedural components that come with that. Typically, goals are just, it's like a number, it's an idea, it's a vision, but really it's hard to anchor. And this is just my opinion, this is just my approach. I'm not saying this is gospel, but the fact of the matter is I've seen greater success in the work that I do by reframing goals into commitments, because immediately the level of ownership rises and we start to talk more about the process. And for me, commitments also demand that we look at things through this lens of what would be optimal. And this is one of those words that people hear it and sometimes they hear it. And I've never really gone into the framing of the word optimal on this show before in the sense of how I use it, because sometimes I'll say optimal and people will hear ideal. Sometimes I'll say optimal and some people will hear perfect. And it's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. Optimal is for me, it's a sense of reality combined with a sense of direction. It's like, okay, what is realistic and what is the direction? What is the not necessarily the destination we're trying to get to, but what is the direction that we're trying to go in with this work? And when we arrive at a certain juncture, why will we feel as though this is the best way we could have done it, the optimal way we could have done it, and give us a sense of, hey, this is the return that we wanted to get from that. And at the heart of that work that I always love prefacing as well is this sense of honesty, is bringing truth into the room. And again, it's why I love starting this where we did, and then the way it's starting to go is when we just focus on the goal, it's hard for us to speak to a sense of reality and honesty, because really that goal is this thing in the future that isn't real yet. Whereas when we look at it as a commitment and what's optimal, we can actually come into the present and say, what are we doing right now? Honestly, what are we doing right now to serve the commitment that we've built or we've created for this business, for myself, for instance? Yeah. And suddenly now you hear that and you go, well, I can speak to that. That's happening right now. I can look at that through this lens of truth and say, hey, this is the reality of the situation versus this is the sense of reality that I may be creating for myself much further down the road based on a goal that I've created that really isn't true until we actually arrive at that. And so the reason why I even mention that is that optimization starts with a sense of direction, a sense of reality, and then we use that direction and that reality to always return to the present moment and ask, how can we be optimizing what we're doing right now to get to where it is that we believe is optimal in the future?
Yeah. Do you mind if I do a bit of teaching?
Do it. Great time for it.
I think we need to just do some teaching about how to create goals, because this is something that I see people don't do very well. And what I see is people pick arbitrary targets. Like, my young athletes would be, I want to do a flying 200 meters in 10 seconds. I'd be like, where are you now? I'm doing 13 seconds. Okay, so why are we talking about 10 seconds instead of 12.5, for example? Right. And I think when we're creating goals, one, we have to do it in conjunction with the person we're creating goals with. So something I often see leaders do is they create goals for their team or specific team members with no input from the team member. So that person has no ownership of the goals because they don't feel like theirs. So when I used to sit down with an athlete, I would say, right, okay, what are your goals for this year? And I would want them to be super specific. So none of it would be an outcome goal, as in I want to win the national championships. They would all be performance goals. So what is it we need to do? So in a business, it might be you have a goal of what you're going to get your CAC to, so your customer acquisition cost. What are we going to get that down to? How are we going to do that? A goal might be, right, we need to be profitable by here, by this point here. And what is that going to take? And then you work backwards from that outcome to, right, now what performance goals do we have to do to be able to get to this outcome goal? So you might look at it in Olympics and say, right, how much power does an Olympic champion need to make? How fast do they need to go? What does their aerodynamic drag need to be to add that power to that drag to get the speed outcome that you want? And then you need to go back to, okay, where do you need to be 6 months before the Olympics, and then a year before the Olympics, and then 5 years before the Olympics? That takes us to today. Where are we now? What do I need to do today as the first stepping stone to getting towards that? And I really liked what you said about optimal. My favorite term is effective. Like, what do I need to do to be most effective? Because people get really hooked on perfect. That was a great statement, Steve. And Seth Godin has lots of information on this. I highly recommend you go and check out his talks on the difference between getting something done and something being done perfectly. And done, his phrase is, done is better than perfect. And so often we're trying to make things perfect, and it's also a protective measure for us. Oh, if I make it perfect, I will succeed. Instead of, actually, I just need to get it done out the door and on to the next thing. And there's this protection behind the perfect. It keeps us stuck from ever having to do things, because we're like, oh, I could always do it better. You know, I think about this room here, right? So we joked about my room, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to get onto bigger podcasts until my background is really nice. And then when I threw that away and said, it doesn't really matter, let's just get on stuff, I'm getting on bigger podcasts anyway. Nobody cares about my background except for me. And that's the other thing. We care sometimes too much about things that actually are relevant to the bigger picture, the bigger message, and what we're trying to achieve. So I think with goals, we've got to be like, right, who are we setting these goals with? They need to be part of it. So we ask them first, what do you think? What's your goal? What can you achieve? And then there's the leaders. We have an idea of where we want them to get. And often high performers will set their goals too high, and we might need to bring them back and say, well, how about we get to this bit first before we get to that bit, so that it doesn't crush them, so it doesn't become unrealistic. And then the other thing for goals to be really effective is every party needs to buy in. You called them commitments, I would call them agreements. This is what we're agreeing to do. And agreement needs every party to say yes to it. And if people can't say yes, why not? And what do we need to do to get there? When you arbitrarily give people goals, they're not as strong for them, and they're not as powerful for them than when somebody comes to you and says, this is what I think I can do, and you help them shape that into measurable goals. And that's the other thing, and you mentioned at the beginning, these days we can measure everything. Absolutely everything. How many clicks our adverts are getting, what kind of engagement, how long they're staying on, how long they're staying on our websites for, whether they buy or they don't, and what page they leave when they don't buy. We have so much information that we can get caught in too much of it. We want to be very clear about what information actually matters and what doesn't, and letting go of the stuff that doesn't, and be very clear about what is the information that's going to drive my business forwards. And this is sometimes why we need outside support. People like me and you, maybe business consultants that come in and look at what you're doing and help you get more effective, more optimized, because we need to continually be looking at this. And this brings me right back to the beginning of people get caught too much in their day-to-day and don't take themselves out, elevate themselves, look in over their business and take a real hard look at, are we optimized right now, or am I just busy? Because it's super easy to be busy as a leader. There's so much going on. There's so much that you can be doing. Am I actually optimized? Am I being the most effective version of myself towards our outcome goal?
Yeah, love all that. And the word relevance just kept coming to my mind as you were talking. Just how do you make it relevant? How do you make it relevant? And one client I'm working with currently specifically that just keeps popping up as we're talking about this is, you know, as we committed at the beginning, well, it was we started working sort of Q4 of 2024. And as we outlined our commitments, and we got about 2 months ago, we got about 6 months through the work. And it was amazing how easy it was for them to sort of then go back and look at those commitments that we made in Q4 of 2024 as they were halfway through or just starting out Q2 of 2025 and saying, okay, we're looking at this now. And it's fascinating that we can see that there's one or two of these commitments that we made that have absolutely no relevance to what it is we're actually trying to achieve. Now, as the coach, it's not for me in those initial strategy sessions to tell them what is and what is not relevant. That's the beauty of the work that we do, buddy. It's like we get to help develop what is and what is not relevant. Because at that moment, 7 or 8 months ago, it really spoke to the room and everyone was like, absolutely, let's commit to that. Yes. And it's funny, you said something there about clicks. It was based around marketing, and it was like, there was something that they wanted to achieve through marketing. And what the relevance that came through was that it turns out that all the growth that we've achieved and all the growth that we will go on and achieve will not come from how we market ourselves, because marketing actually hasn't been the source of our growth. Like but it's this temptation, right? It's out there. It's like, well, everyone's marketing, everyone's investing in marketing. Like, why wouldn't we be marketing? And it's like, it's not a hit against marketing. It just so happens in this particular industry and the way in which they market themselves, it's tricky at times. And there's ways that you can grow without really making marketing part of anything particularly relevant when it comes to immeasurable. And so that's the beauty of what we're talking about here, is that when we have the goal, and I appreciate you even helping us better understand how we create the goals. When we create those goals and we check in at these certain junctures, like again, it's like, oh, halfway through the year, why wouldn't I check in on my goals?
But pause you there.
Yeah.
Do you know how many people actually do that? I bet it's less than 50% of business people actually check in halfway through the year and say, how am I doing against my goals?
Right.
And most importantly, what needs to change?
Yes. And that's where, and for me, that's the beauty of the relevance conversation. The topic of relevance is it brings everybody with a sense of curiosity and abundance. And we talked about, like, we don't want to be operating from scarcity. We want to be in prosperity, abundance mindset, etc. We shift into abundance mindset. We shift into a willingness to change when we look at it and say, hey, is what we're doing right now serving us? Is it still relevant the way we thought it was relevant 6 months ago, for instance? And if we look at it that way and just start saying, well, 80% of it, chances are, is relevant. This is not a time. I very much doubt that people are getting halfway through the year, especially folks listening to the show, and saying, time to throw it all out and start this business over from scratch. That's not what we're talking about here. Typically, we're talking about running this thing with a fine-tooth comb and saying, okay, there's a couple of things here that we need to talk about. When you talk about those things, to be able to say, okay, what is it about these that, from a sense of relevance, are they still serving us? Have they ever been serving us? And is this a time for us to consider change? And if we were to consider change, what would change look like? And you'll notice that every single question and thought that I had there, none of it came from a sense of self-criticism or judgment. It was just curiosity, abundance mindset, and wondering, how else could we be doing this? Or how else, to your point from the beginning about meetings, how else could we be using our time? How else could I be using my time? I want to just really quickly provide this anecdote. I got it from the book Traction. They talk about rocks in the book Traction, and they give this great definition of the term rocks, and it's sort of sprints, if you will, of every quarter, certain goals, big goals that you have. And we look at the rocks as the large goals, 3 to 7 goals that we have every quarter. And if you have an empty jar and you fill that jar with water first, and that's the day-to-day monotony stuff that you've been referring to, Lee. If we fill it with water first, and then we try to put sand, and then we try to put rocks in, the moment you put a few sprinkles of sand, that thing starts to overflow. But when you start with the rocks, you put a few rocks in, then you fill that with sand, and then you just try to put a little bit of water in. The water is, in many ways, the irrelevance. The sand is some of that day-to-day stuff that you know is essential. And then the rocks are these things that, hey, I don't want to suddenly turn this into an EOS podcast, but at the same time, it's like, it's a great analogy.
My wife's just working through that now with her coach.
Right, there you go. So it's just like the EOS, but it's like, okay, give us some, residuals EOS. I'll just give you a little hype here, but very different product to what Lee and I do. But at the same time, it's like, okay, that analogy is so powerful in this sort of moment. It's just like, okay, if we're so sure, or we can become sure on the relevant goals that we need to have within our organization, how can we use those as a way to come into the present and have these conversations around just becoming more aware, questioning what's relevant, and hopefully getting to a point where we can actually have rational change within the organization too?
Yeah. I think I'd like to start really getting into takeaways for people now. And one of them is you have to have reflection periods. So you have to have booked into your calendar, right, I'm just going to take an overview of everything. Are we optimized? Are we being our most effective and efficient right now? And what can I let go of? That should be top of that agenda. What can I let go of? What can I give to somebody else in the organization? Or what can we let go of as an organization? You know, you talk about marketing. I don't know what it was like for you when you started in this business, but when I started, and now still, I get 50 emails a day from people telling me that they'll turn me into a 6 or 7 figure coach. I'm like, well,
people
I
are
don't
so
know what
nice.
I do, clearly.
Yeah. People are so nice, right? They're just
They are.
always offering, like they want to help me have a 7-figure business.
Yes.
It's so nice.
Yeah.
So nice.
But I get this stuff and it's all based about marketing. You know what? I don't think I've got a client from marketing. My clients are all from word of mouth, from other people that I work with that recommend me to other leaders. Or, you know, somebody will post on a forum, hey, we've got a situation in our company, we need some support from them. Somebody will go, I know this coach that can help. So it's a word of mouth business. Yeah, I have people trying to sell me marketing schemes continually that just work for them. They just get paid. Me and Sarah, so for those listeners, my wife has a psychotherapy business. We employed 2 different marketers over a 2-year period. We spent $50,000 with these people over 2 years. Neither of us got one client from it. And, you know, even now, me and you doing this podcast, a lot of people would look at this as marketing. This isn't marketing for me. I actually do this podcast because it's an opportunity to hang out with you, Steve. It's an opportunity for me to be a better coach, because when you're describing and explaining things to other people, you've really got to think about it. And I walk away from each of these having learned something from you and having learned something from myself as I process what it is that we're going to talk about. And I genuinely believe my role in this world is to be of service to others. And sometimes that's going to be tied to a financial outcome and sometimes it's not. And it's my purpose to improve the world so that people have better experiences, more enjoyable experiences. And I trust that I will get rewarded for that in a adequate manner for the amount of energy that I put into it and the amount that I put into the world. And that sounds unbelievably wooey for me, if you know me, who is, you know, a former data scientist and not at all religious and,
Right.
you know, just things are what they are. But I do trust in humanity, and what you give is what you receive. And not necessarily in a karmic way, but just in a people pick up on it. And if you're a decent person, you go out there and you're giving a lot of energy to the world, people pick up on it. And kind of tying this back to us as business leaders, the more curious we can be, the kinder that we can be, the more that we take ourselves out, we elevate ourselves, we look down into our business, onto our business and go, what do we need to do? What do we need to change? Where do we need to put our energy? Instead of getting stuck in the day to day. And every time I hear a founder say to me, I'm too busy, I'm overwhelmed, I want to invite them into, okay, take a step back. What can you let go of? What needs to change? What can you give to somebody else? And for me, often, I'll be curious what it comes down to you. For me, so much of it is about trust. It's about trusting other people. It's about trusting a long-term process. So we're not doing all this superfluous stuff because we trust in the plan that we've created to get us where we want to go to. And people just keep adding stuff on top of it. If I just do this, it'll give me 1% more. And it's like, yeah, but you're spending 25% of your time to get a 1% gain instead of putting that 25% into something that might give you a 30% gain.
Yeah. And trusting yourself.
Did I make sense there, Steve?
You did. And I think for me, in terms of takeaways for listeners here, it's so easy to make this about X's and O's and measurables. And so much of what you and I are talking about here, you talk about trust of those around you, trust of systems, trust of this, trust of that. For me, when I think about the work that I do, a lot of it, I always like to say, like, typically when a client brings a problem, there's typically a problem beneath the problem, and sometimes even double down yet again.
Yep.
And when there's maybe a sense of to use your example, if we don't trust the current people around us to get to the goals we're trying to get to, chances are after a little bit of work, that leader, that founder realizes quickly that they don't have a sense of trust towards themselves in some capacity. There's something about it. I had that very recently, actually, in the last month with a client of mine. It's like they want to pass things off. They want to assign things off more consistently. And what they're noticing is that they just simply don't trust themselves. They don't trust themselves to assign it and leave it alone. They don't trust themselves to do it. So like, well, and it's just like, that is a great example of when we think about the goals and we bring all the way back to what this episode's about. When we tie ourselves up in the goal and we don't make it about how can we talk about how we're showing up, what it is that we're doing consistently day in, day out, the behaviors, the mindset, the perspective that we bring into the work we do every day. When we focus more on that, we realize quite quickly that the goals are a product of that. They really are, because the way you show up and how you work is impacting those outcomes more than anything. Even the greatest processes and systems that are out there on this planet, no doubt they produce phenomenal results, but there's still people behind those. There's still mindsets. There's still perspectives behind those. And if we're not showing up in the relevant mindset, in the necessary mindset, and doing that kind of work as the leaders and founders that we are, we're never going to look at those processes correctly. We're never going to look at those goals the way that we should be either. And I think that, for me, is the takeaway here, is how can you do the honest work around yourself and around those people around you, the behaviors and the way in which we're communicating and treating one another, the relationships, and then start to do the assessment and the growth around that to inevitably start to bring in the processes and bring in the results that you're looking for long-term as well.
Yeah. It reminds me of the difference between what we do and what a consultant does.
Yeah.
So I'm not a consultant, and people say, well, what's the difference? A consultant will come in and tell you how to optimize your business and how to run it correctly for your outcomes. And then what happens is you don't do it. You don't do it because the same emotional patterns, the same fear, and a lot of what we spoke about today is around fear. There's so much fear that people have. You talk about scarcity, it's fear. It's like, I won't succeed, this isn't going to succeed, and then we come from that place instead of, well, actually, what's the right thing to do, and how do I support people instead of shout at them or push them because of fear? How do I make them, motivate them with fear, which is not great. So the difference between a consultant and what we do is a consultant tells you how to run your business. I help you get out of your way so you can actually take their advice. Yeah. I help you understand what it is, your behavioral patterns that getting in the way of you making the optimal choices. I love that word. And there is stuff from our childhood, from the way that we relate to other people, from the patterns that we've learned in life, from our own genetic makeup, that gets in the way of us being our most optimal and effective selves. And mine and your job is to uncover that, reflect it to you, reflect how it shows up in all of your relationships, work relationships, familial relationships, romantic relationships, so that now you have choice to go, I'd like to do this differently. And I'll just leave a little anecdote. A client that I work with related to everything as being hard. This is tough. This is hard. It's a burden. And there was a switch created through the work that resulted in them relating to it as, this is a gift. I get to do this. Not many people get to run a business. This is a gift. I get to be in charge. I get to choose what's going to happen. And I get to choose how I'm going to spend my time. I get to choose how my business is run rather than someone else telling me how to do it. And that was unbelievable for them, to the point that it took a business that was struggling and losing money into profit purely from the founder's shift of this is a burden to this is a privilege.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to close this. What do you get to do in the second half of 2025 that you haven't been able to do up to this point that's going to give you a return that you get to have that you otherwise wouldn't have got? Yeah. I want to leave it right there. That's a beautiful sentiment. It's a great question.
And how do you relate to it as a privilege instead of a burden?
Right. And so if we step into the second half of this year with a sense of the privilege that comes with getting to do what you do and getting to achieve the results that you get to achieve, I think we're all going to be prosperous in terms of what's coming ahead, and we're going to be looking at whatever we have to do to get there. through a very different lens. So love the anecdote and love the way to sort of close this out, brother.
Yeah, and as we're talking about that, I have a target for one more business. So if you're listening to this and you want some support and you want a coach to come in and work with multiple people in your business and you as a founder so that you can move from burden to privilege and you can move from feeling burnt out to joyous and energized, give me a shout. Give Steve a shout. Get in touch. It can change. It really can.
It really can. It really can. Well, on that note, as always, appreciate you, brother. Love spending this time with you, as you mentioned there during the podcast. You said that nobody notices your background. I noticed it. I noticed it, but I didn't say anything about it. But I noticed it. But in terms of what we've got coming up, I heard something that you said there towards the end around the importance of us showing up and being a sense of ourself. That if we start to be a certain way as just the human being that we are, everything else typically starts to fall into place. I think we might land. I think we might take things from there next time that we talk and talk a little bit more about the importance of aspiring to be the best version of ourselves and knowing the trickle effect that comes with that. But that's just a little teaser for those of you out there. And
what is your authentic self could be a great episode.
Absolutely. All right, brother. Until next time.
Thank you, mate.
Be well. Thank you.
Bye, friends.
Bye-bye.